How's it going, everyone? Welcome to Localism, the podcast that asks whether we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and guy who recently went to a Halloween party and had somebody say, "Oh, cool, you're dressed as Dale from King of the Hill," even though I was not wearing a costume. Blunchley. In today's episode, localism and the non-contentious, non-controversial issue of immigration. To start off, a very warm welcome to all of our loyal listeners who braved the vast sea of book chats that preceded this episode. In all, we covered 3 books: Barber's McWorld, Beale and Bookchin's Libertarian Municipalism, and French's Divided We Fall. I have to say that I immensely enjoyed the show's book chats arc, and will likely be returning to discuss more books with you all at some point in the not-too-distant future, but I'm also very glad to be returning to the show's normal format of discussing a political topic over 1 or 2 episodes. And boy, is the real world giving us all kinds of events to discuss and to use as a lens through which we can better understand localism. Many of those events have to do with the topic of today's episode, which is immigration and how immigration would work in a localist society. Our discussion is going to come in 2 parts. First, we'll discuss how immigration works legally under the current American system of government and whether or not it's producing desirable results for Americans. Second, we'll explain how immigration might work under a localist system of government and try to anticipate some of the common criticisms of why we might want to manage immigration locally. Let's go. Alright, let's get things rolling by asking a pretty basic question. Why is it that immigration is currently handled the way that it is? Put another way, why is it that immigration is handled by the federal government rather than some other level of government like the state or local government? Here's the easy gimme answer, which you can find in our old friend, the Constitution. Under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4, Congress has the power to, quote, establish an uniform rule of naturalization. Now, naturalization technically has to do with the process of deciding whether or how an immigrant becomes a citizen, which means that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4 does give Congress a lot of power over how immigration works. But what about all that stuff surrounding immigration that doesn't have to do with specifically becoming a citizen? What about, say, just getting a permit to work in the United States, or to go to school here, or just physically be present here for a time? Inasmuch as none of that stuff has to do with naturalization specifically, why does Congress get to make not just laws in those areas, but exclusive and preemptory laws, laws that other levels of government can't override? Well, for one, there's the eternal bugaboo of the Constitution, the Commerce Clause, arguably the most important part of the Constitution when it comes to giving the federal Congress the ability to do stuff, especially in modern times. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to, quote, regulate commerce with foreign nations, among states, and with the Indian tribes. You may have sometimes heard this general category of commerce between states, nations, and tribes referred to as interstate commerce or international commerce. And it turns out that if you squint, there was a whole lot of shit that arguably falls under the category of international or interstate commerce. Pollution and stuff? Well, pollution is made by big companies that make money through interstate or international commerce. So Congress has the authority to regulate environmental protections. Workplace safety? Again, almost every single business either makes their money in multiple states or buys stuff from multiple states or from abroad. So every single business is arguably within the realm of interstate commerce, and thus Congress has the ability to regulate the standard of safety those businesses must keep in their workplaces. In fact, in an increasingly national and now even global America, it is pretty damn difficult to think of any kind of activity that does not at least in some way touch upon interstate or international commerce. Meaning the Commerce Clause provides Congress a hugely powerful tool for it to pass laws about whatever field it happens to want to get its nasty little claws into on any given day. There are some really interesting discussions to be had about whether the Commerce Clause has been stretched past the breaking point and allowed Congress to reach into realms it was never supposed to. But we aren't having that conversation here because you know what pretty uncontroversially falls into the category of interstate/international commerce? That's right. People moving across national borders for work or to buy stuff. Like, obviously, if you're from another country and you come here to get hired for an American job, that's international commerce. If you come here and use the so-called instrumentalities of commerce, stuff like multinational banks and the internet and shit to send money back to family in another country, international commerce. So, since immigration brushes up against international commerce, the Constitution's Commerce Clause gives Congress a lot of leeway to regulate and pass rules on immigration. But there is one more source of authority under which Congress can regulate immigration, one that is particularly mysterious and hard to define, at least from my perspective. This is the idea that Congress gets to make rules about immigration because it's the legislative branch of a nation, and regulating immigration is just something nations do. If that sounds a little vague, a little dubious, yeah, I kind of agree with you. However, under Supreme Court precedent, this is just a thing that countries do, is genuinely one basis for Congress's immigration authority. Take this language from the 2012 case Arizona v. United States. Quote, "The government of the United States has broad, undoubted power over the subject of immigration and the status of aliens. This authority rests in part on the national government's constitutional power to establish an uniform rule of naturalization," which we just talked about, but also its inherent power as sovereign to control and conduct relations with foreign nations. Inherent power as sovereign? Oh, yeah, famously, America is all about inherent and unstated powers in the Constitution. That's why we have provisions that literally say, let me just check my notes here. Yeah, the federal government only has the powers explicitly laid out in the Constitution. Still, not even I'm going to say that we should tilt at windmills and suddenly claim that actually the Constitution doesn't recognize inherent sovereignty or whatever. And in any event, the naturalization and foreign commerce sections in the Constitution provide a more explicit basis for Congress to manage immigration anyway. Okay, that's all a very long way of saying Congress handles immigration at the federal level because the Constitution says it does. But that's just the descriptive answer. Let's ask the same question in a more prescriptive sense. Why is it that the federal government is in charge of immigration? Is there something about immigration that makes it a topic that is best handled in a top-down, nationwide way rather than on a more local basis? Here's what I guess you could call the federal case for making immigration something that is managed by the federal government. So the whole idea behind the federal government, at least in theory, is that there is some stuff that just would prove to be a huge pain in the ass if we managed it in a piecemeal way, and that benefits hugely from a unified, singular front. It could just be that immigration is one of those things. Sure, maybe an immigrant comes through New York or Texas or California or Florida specifically, but once that person is in the United States, then they could go pretty much anywhere else. What begins as someone coming in at one place could turn into someone popping up in another place. So it just makes sense for the states to all team up using the feds as a vehicle to figure out how immigration is going to work for everyone. Sort of relatedly, who is coming into the country is a matter of national security. If someone gets into, say, Texas with a bomb or drugs or weapons and intends to use those items in a way that harms Americans, then that quickly can become a nationwide problem rather than just a Texas problem. And we tend to see national defense and national security as one of those things that should be handled universally, rather than on a state-by-state basis, because having one joint body in charge during times of war or of national defense is a more efficient self-defense strategy than American states or whatever each going at it alone with no coordination between them. Plus, both sides of the immigration coin, that is, granting immigration benefits and enforcing immigration law against people who have broken it, are just a lot more efficient when we have one hand on the wheel instead of a ton. America's borders stretch across multiple states, to say nothing of how many ways there are to fly into the country from abroad. Can you imagine what it would be like if we had to recreate 50 separate immigration bureaus in each state and then have these border fences that were like, okay, this part is Washington's job to handle, and this part is Idaho's, and this part is Montana's? Wouldn't that just result in a shit ton of redundancy and waste? Better to just have one joint party that handles all this stuff on all the states' behalf, and have all the states chip in a little tax revenue to let this party do its job and figure out how all this immigration stuff is going to work and pass the right laws. Maybe we could call this party, I don't know, some kind of Congress? In short, why, practically speaking, prescriptively speaking, do we leave immigration to be handled at the federal level? One answer is that it's because it's cheaper, safer, and more effectively administered that way. Convincing enough, right? Well, it may not surprise you that on this show called Localism, we're about to argue that actually the system does not make sense and should be managed in a more locally centered way. Or at least allow for more local autonomy and decision-making when it comes to immigration law. And our ultimate argument is going to be that letting the federal government govern immigration in the way that it currently does mostly makes everyone miserable. But before getting into my sophistry, let me start by asking a really basic question. Think about all the upsides I just mentioned. Centralizing immigration enforcement allows for cheaper, safer, and more effective administration of when and how people are allowed to move across national borders and remain in the United States. So, taking that as the goal, we should just try and make things more and more centralized, right? Here's a good first step. Instead of having an American Congress handle immigration, why don't we set up some kind of broader North and Central American immigration body? I mean, think about it. In the same way that fentanyl entering Florida can kill people in Philadelphia, chemicals entering a port in Oaxaca could end up causing trouble in California. And the same is the opposite, too. Guns flowing out of America are responsible for a shit ton of trouble abroad. Seriously, gun trafficking from America into Mexico is a huge problem. So why don't all these countries just get together and form one joint ruling body that takes care of immigration for everyone? Stuff that happens in North America and Central America affects us all. Rather than reproduce 3 Congresses across 3 countries and 3 associated immigration bureaus, wouldn't it be a lot efficient and safer if we all form a big team to handle all this stuff together? Think of the cost savings. Think of all the reduction in government waste. Think about all that clarity and consistency across what would apply across this fun little American continental immigration zone. Sounds great, right? Except it kind of doesn't, does it? I don't know about you, but when I suddenly hear the idea, let's just have one big immigration body run everything for everybody, alarm bells started going off in my head. For one, despite all these claims about things working much more efficiently via one centralized body, that isn't always the case. It turns out that the bigger and more centralized and more distant and more widespread a system gets, the more it can really be susceptible to operations issues. For example, as of now, there's something like 3.7 million pending cases in immigration court, which is an insane backlog. Meanwhile, immigration courts are completing somewhere in the realm of 900,000 cases a year, and that's based on last year's figures, which were some of the highest this decade and even this century. So even assuming that no new cases are filed in this upcoming year, unlikely given current events, it would take the court like 4 years just to get through its current backlog. Now imagine the system writ large across multiple countries. How bad would the backlog get then? How slow and bureaucratic might the system become? Sure, some might say that the reason the current federal courts are so slow on this shit is just because Congress hasn't passed laws giving them enough funding or hiring enough judges, but this isn't just a problem you can throw money at until it goes away. So maybe we don't want to just hand off immigration authority to some centralized body that unites several disparate governments. Maybe, crazy thought, it's actually better to have each of the North and Central America countries handle immigration on their own. And if it makes sense for each country, why not lower levels of government? Why not states? Why not localities? Then there's the issue of trust. Maybe part of the reason we don't want to share a joint immigration enforcement system with other countries is because we are suspicious that they'll actually enforce the laws in ways that we agree with. But under that logic, why do we trust that the centralized federal immigration authority in America is more ethical or tighter with the letter of the law or more well run than one composed of citizens from multiple governments? Maybe we think there's some great American ethic or some component of our government that makes it so those that our Congress chooses to put in charge of immigration enforcement, or the people we put in Congress to pass immigration policy, or the people that the president appoints are just better than what we would get if we were pulling from Canadians and Mexicans as well. That could be true or not, I don't know. But when we talk about trust, we aren't just talking about the people at the top. We're also talking about the rank and file, the officials and police officers and court clerks and border guards who actually enforce immigration on a day-to-day basis. And if your thought when I suggested joining immigration forces with Mexico and Canada was something like, what? No, I don't trust people who live under a different and distant government and a different and distant culture than me to be fair and impartial about the law in the way that I would want them to be, then I have a question for you. The vast majority of the people working in immigration right now are from different states than you. They may also be from different community settings than you. So why do you trust them to be fair and impartial or otherwise enforce a law in a way you deem appropriate? Sure, maybe they live in a place that has the same flag at the top of the flagpole, and I do think that really means something, even in the times we're living in. But man, look at the state of the country. We're just not at a place right now where you, the person listening to this, can guarantee that all the immigration officials and frontline workers are fulfilling their duties in a way that will comport with your values, to say nothing of their leadership. The San Diego, California port official and the Eagle Point, Texas border guard likely understand their duties and their ethical responsibilities as immigration officers in completely different, possibly incompatible ways. And you and the people in your community probably view proper enforcement of immigration laws in a way that's totally different from the port official and the border guard. Even putting aside the actual content of immigration laws, we can't guarantee or agree with the people who are enforcing those laws about what those laws should mean and how they should be implemented. To an extent, though, these points are kind of just intellectual hand waving. There's a more fundamental point I'm trying to make here, a more fundamental reason that we couldn't just band together with Mexico and Canada and create some kind of regional or continental coordinated immigration body. That's because at its core, immigration is about values, like normative values, morals, worldviews, personal opinions. When you're trying to decide the laws that will make up your immigration policy, you're asking a couple of pretty simple to express but hard to answer questions. Those questions include, who do we want to be our neighbors? Who do we want to live in our communities with us? What qualifications and requirements do we want to put on place on immigrants before we allow them to assume the privileges and responsibilities of community membership? What level of risk of bad actors or other danger are we willing to accept to make it easier for people from other countries who we do want to be here to come join us? Yes, immigration is also about all that stuff I said before, public safety, the economy, whatever. But when you're deciding how immigration will interact with defense and labor and commerce, you just end up facing down all these normative, morals, values-based questions again. These kinds of questions aren't really answerable with cold facts or science or whatever. They are essentially political questions. They're personal ones. And they're the kinds of questions that every community is going to have its own perspective on. So although we live alongside Mexico and Canada, and might even find a lot of similarities with those countries, the people who live there have their own normative value sets that may or may not track with our own. For both of our preferences to be respected, for our American immigration laws and enforcement to track our normative values and Mexican and Canadian laws to track their moral values, it's better for all our countries to handle immigration in our own particular ways. We can find ways to cooperate with each other in the areas we have similarities on, sure, but Americans and Mexicans and Canadians need and should have the ability to make their own decisions for themselves. And you can probably see where I'm going with this. It's not just Canadians and Mexicans that Americans have normative differences from when it comes to immigration. Americans also have normative differences from one another. Serious differences. So serious that it simply isn't possible that a joint body of immigration law created by a single overarching federal Congress is still capable of representing all those values together. To create a just immigration law, an immigration law that respects all of our values and preferences, we need to have more on-the-ground authority to decide the answers to the normative questions underlying immigration for ourselves, rather than have them dictated to us from above. And that's true no matter whether you're on the right or the left. Okay, I've been going on about all this normative value shit and, wholesome chungus political agency and twisty logic or whatever. Now it's time to get into a fan favorite, contemporary events. Let's take a peek at how things are going on the ground right now when it comes to immigration. How's the old federal immigration system working? Everybody happy? Well, not so much. I've been pretty open about the fact that I'm a bleeding heart left-wing lib, so I'm going to speak to that perspective first and then get to why Republicans, arguably, I think shouldn't be happy either with how immigration works. As far as I'm concerned, I don't actually give much of a shit about whether you have some magic documents or a social security number or were born here or whatever when it comes to whether or not I want you living in my town. What makes you an American and what makes you part of my community is living here, staying out of trouble, paying your taxes, sending your kids to school, chipping in and contributing to the community. If you're doing all that, then you're just as much a part of my community in my eyes as somebody who happened to have the good fortune to be born here. And if you're doing all that, I also don't really care what particular means you use to come here, legal or otherwise. Now, I will say that if you come in from another country and proceed to waste that opportunity by stealing or selling drugs or hurting somebody, then I'm sorry. I'm in complete favor of sending your ass back to wherever you came from. Assuming, of course, that your guilt can be proven in a court of law after a full and fair trial. But that is not what is happening right now, at all. Instead, we have a federal apparatus that is just kind of picking people up off the street or from a job site or out of their homes because they happen to not have the magic papers and also happen to be from a country our federal government doesn't like this week. We're talking kids, mothers, fathers, grandparents, neighbors, teachers, public servants, community members. And yeah, some real bad people too, and good riddance to them. But the focus right now from the federal government isn't on just getting rid of some bad apples. It's on intentionally seeking out people who look and talk a certain way and getting rid of them precisely because they look and talk a certain way. Now, I can practically hear some people listening to this going, actually, these guys are all criminals because it's a crime to come into the country. Man, shut the fuck up. I don't care. Going through a gap in a fence to try and find a better life, assuming that's truly all you want to do and you're not seeking it for a more nefarious purpose, is a crime in the same way that, like, speeding is a crime. It's a technical violation of the law, sure, but who cares? I bet that everybody listening to this has broken the law in one way or another, whether that's speeding by more than 20 miles per hour above the speed limit or trespassing or whatever. Here's a fun one. It's a crime to possess alcohol under the age of 21 in most states, like an actual crime. It goes on your criminal record. Even if you didn't personally do that, listener, bet your ass there are people in your life who you love and respect who were absolutely possessing alcohol before they were of age. And because those people broke the law at some point, that makes them by definition criminals, right? So police should be able to throw them in cages and pull them out of their homes and do pretty much whatever the fuck they want to do with them, right? It just makes no sense. Going through a hole in a fence and then proceeding to live peacefully isn't really all that different from having a drink when you're younger than 21 in my book. Now, just like if you happen to hop in a motor vehicle while you're drinking, if you happen to cross that fence with the intention of doing evil, then that's a whole different story. But that's the point. It's not the bare act of entering the country that renders you morally culpable. It's twisting or warping the act with some additional element of wrong. And the people at the top know this. They don't actually give a shit about whether you're a criminal or not, or whether the thing you did was harmful to anybody. Some of them sincerely, just think that kicking as many immigrants out of America as possible and causing as much suffering as possible will make things better for the rest of us. And if you ask me, that's just clearly not true. It's going to turn out to have been a huge mistake that will fix nothing while, yes, punishing some people who deserve it, but mostly just fucking over people who wanted to live here peacefully and build a better life for themselves and call themselves Americans. Political philosophy aside, localism aside, the thing that pisses me off about this is the human cost and the sheer stupidity. But there is another way in which the current immigration enforcement surge is causing harm too. Now, obviously, the people it is hurting the worst and most directly are the immigrants who are being unfairly targeted, who haven't done anything wrong and simply want to live here in peace. But even if you're not an immigrant, it may be doing violence to you too. And here's why I think so. If you're a big ol' shitlib like me, you probably live in a community that shares a lot of my opinions on who should and shouldn't be allowed to live here. And it's your community. Not some politician in DC's, not some bureaucrat in some federal field office, not some slick state politician. It's yours. And what you say should go in your own community. Instead, you have outsiders coming in and imposing their values and their preferences on who you think should be allowed to live next door to you. It's insane. It truly does not matter what you think should be going on in your own community. Instead, it's a federal apparatus put into place by people who live hundreds or even thousands of miles away from you. If those people want to be shitty in their own communities, fine, that's their right. But what gives them the right to dictate to you from afar who you should be allowed to call neighbor and welcome into your community, and then send in federally funded, jackbooted thugs to impose that vision by force? Immigration is a divisive topic, and there was an opportunity here for Trump and Republicans to go, we're going to go where we're invited. We're going to tackle illegal immigrants in the places that want us to and leave those communities alone that feel differently. But no. Fuck local control. Fuck this being a nation of limited federal government. Fuck greater liberty on the ground to make our own policy decisions. Fuck all that shit that Republicans say that they're for. Instead, all that matters is what the fat cats in Washington, D.C. want to do, and fuck you if you think you deserve the right to say, hey, actually we'd like to decide for ourselves who we want our neighbors to be. That was all a very long and very triggered way of saying if you're a liberal, you're probably pissed about Trump and immigration right now because A, it's hurting people, and B, it's completely overriding your community's political agency to form its own judgments. Now, if you're a Republican, you are probably loving this stuff and loving the seed that just came through from me. You're probably excited to see a president that's actually doing what you want, removing criminals that make your community less safe, upholding the law, and controlling America's borders. You probably just heard all that stuff I was saying and went, this guy's an idiot. He's been completely brainwashed by liberal media. All Trump is doing is making it so if you want to come to America, you have to do so legally. And he's tackling the problem of the drug and human trafficking criminal enterprises that illegal immigration enables. Instead of worrying about criminals who snuck their way into the country, why don't you worry about the Americans who have been victims of crimes committed by illegal immigrants or have family that has died from drug overdoses? I'm sure my pencil pusher voice and general liberal shrillness have put my Trump derangement syndrome on full display, which, hey, fair enough. To be clear, I completely don't agree with your views on this. If you're a Republican and you view immigration in the way I just described, I think you're wrong. But I'm not actually here to argue with you about how immigration should be viewed in terms of me saying, here's who you should accept as your neighbor. Instead, I'm here to make a different argument. Here's why I think I can get you to agree that the current immigration system is broken because it concentrates all power at the federal level. It's not because of the specific stuff that's happening. It's because the stuff that's happening took this long to happen and is happening at the level that it is. In other words, why is it only now that conservative communities are able to enforce their values when it comes to who gets to live there? Why did Republicans in places uniquely burdened by immigration have to wait so long for their relief? The answer is because of the top-down nature of immigration in America. Because in America, it doesn't matter what people actually want on the ground. It only matters what the people at the top want. And until pretty recently, that person on top was none other than Joe Biden. Here's a story from a few news cycles past, one that you Republicans might have forgotten now that you've gotten everything you've ever wanted and more when it came to immigration. During most of Biden's term, Texas and the feds were essentially at war regarding immigration. The day Biden was inaugurated, his acting head of Homeland Security declared a 100-day moratorium for deportations of most non-citizens. Texas sued. During the first round of his presidency, Trump had begun the Remain in Mexico practice, which meant that migrants and asylum seekers needed to stay in Mexico border towns as they awaited their immigration court dates. Biden ended the practice, and Texas sued. In 2024, Biden announced a new policy under which law-abiding illegal immigrants who were spouses or stepchildren of U.S. citizens could get green cards more easily. Texas, again, sued. Starting to get the picture? Basically, Biden did a whole bunch of shit that people who lived in communities near the southern border did not agree with. And because of the way that the immigration system works in America, those communities were not permitted to decide for themselves what kind of immigration law made sense where they lived. Instead, it was the federal apparatus, an apparatus overwhelmingly put in place by liberal voters in urban communities hundreds or thousands of miles away from the southern border, who got to dictate from afar how immigration was going to work in those communities in Texas and Arizona and New Mexico that were closest to where illegal immigration was occurring. So the people who lived in those places really only had two options because of the top-down federal system. One, just sit around and wait and hope that eventually their guy would be in charge again, which miraculously did ultimately end up being the case, but pretty easily could have gone in a different way. Two, try and do some bullshit maneuvering through the courts and change how the law worked everywhere, because that's unfortunately what it takes to change how the law works just in your own backyards. To be sure, some of the Texans who got excited about these lawsuits and beating Biden in court were excited specifically because it was fucking over people in other communities 1,000 miles away, for example New York City, who the Republicans happen to dislike. However, I'm willing to bet that most of them don't actually care that much about what liberals in New York are or aren't doing, versus wanting to see their preferences and values reflected in the laws that govern their communities. And the need to change law on a federal scale was an unfortunate necessity that they had to undertake in order to achieve that more basic goal, rather than being the goal itself. But maybe the most interesting conflicts that came out of this era were the ones that didn't involve states or localities sitting around with their thumbs up their asses waiting for a different president, or trying to win through stupid legal sophistry. It came from attempts, purely state level or more local attempts, that tried to tackle immigration on the ground in ways that wouldn't extend past state borders. You probably remember something in the news about shipping containers on the border. Yeah, the full story was that in 2022, Arizona's Republican governor took a look at portions of the border and didn't like what he saw. So he started using state funds to build a slapdash wall along the border by stacking shipping containers double tall and topping them with razor wire. Now, there are about a million things to criticize about this idea from my perspective, both because of my own lefty social sensibilities and under the theory that this design for wall is stupid as fuck and probably wasn't very effective. But you know what? I don't live in Arizona. I don't live in those counties near the border. As far as I'm concerned, what happens there is absolutely none of my business. Just as I would get really pissed if an Arizona conservative from Yuma County decided to hop on a plane and start dictating policy to us at our town hall meetings. So as far as I'm concerned, if these counties want to put shipping containers up on their border, it's not my place to interfere with that decision. I'm happy to share my personal opinion that doing so is a mistake and stupid, but I'm not about to reach into those communities and tie their hands and impose my will from afar. But that's exactly what the Biden admin did. Biden sued on the basis that, actually this is federal land and also environmental law for some reason. Whatever the reason given, the intent was obvious. Localities and states don't get to make decisions about immigration. We, the feds, do, even if that means forcing you to do things that nobody in your community agrees with. So if you try to do something about it on your own without respecting your federal bosses, we're going to punish you for it. Something similar happened in Texas. In 2023, the Texas state legislature, possibly my least favorite state government in America, longtime listeners know that I'd love to shit on Texas, passed a law called Senate Bill 4, or SB 4 for short. The state law basically created a state-level, Texas-only immigration enforcement system that was entirely separate from the federal system. SB 4 allowed Texas police to detain people who were suspected of being illegal immigrants, charge them with a state crime of illegal entry or even illegal re-entry, and then give them state law criminal sentences of up to 20 years in prison. SB 4 also gave state judges the right to order that someone be deported. Now, again, do I think any of this is a remotely good idea? No. But it's not like Texas was saying this is how it's going to work everywhere, including where I live. It was Texas saying this is how it's going to work in Texas. And I don't live in Texas. So frankly, it's not really my business. The one aspect of this I do feel qualified to criticize is that Texas localities were not given a choice on whether they thought SB 4 was a good idea. Fresh off undoubtedly explaining why states should have more say in immigration because of local variations of values and the desire for closer accountability, Texas then proceeded to say SB 4 is how things are going to work across the whole state, and if you live in a community that disagrees, sorry, just obey your orders from the top like a good little soldier. The hypocrisy bugs me. But that aside, fine. You want to have your own special immigration system in your corner of the country? That's okay by me, as long as you don't try to extend that system to apply in my community. You know who it's not okay by? The federal government. Biden's admin immediately sued and argued that immigration law was the exclusive province of the feds and that Congress would tolerate no attempts at people on the ground making their own decisions. Thank you very much. And they got us tied up in the courts for years. The feds argued preemption, and under the current state of American law, they are probably right. So Texans who viewed SB 4 as something they'd like to be in effect in their communities were stymied by the vagaries of the federal court system and the nature of federal law as something that prevents you from making your own decisions about the laws in your own backyard. Basically, here's what I'm trying to convince you Republicans. Sure, things might be great for you right now because it's your guy at the top. But if you really want control, actual local control over the way that immigration works in your community, you simply cannot count on always having someone you agree with be the guy in the big presidential chair. You also simply cannot count on always having your team be the one that controls Congress. And even when you do manage to line all that shit up, you still have to wait for Congress and the president to actually get off their asses and address things in a timely manner. Is that really how you want things to work? Always sitting around waiting for daddy federal government to come charging over the hill and grace you with a bit of favorable law or action from on high? The whole point of conservatism is that the federal government is bad at doing shit. Why have it be that way? Why not make it so that you and your neighbors and friends and fellow community members can decide for yourself how immigration is going to work where you live? The very fact that you're so excited right now is because things are so broken and so fucked up that you had to wait for decades for someone like Trump to show up. Does that really seem like the best, most timely, most fair way that we can handle immigration? Fine, so maybe stuff isn't going so hot right now with how the federal government is handling immigration, regardless of whether you're on the left or the right. Since I've been complaining so much, got any brighter ideas, dumbass? Why, yes. Thank you for asking. I think that immigration should be handled on a more locality-by-locality basis, and here's how I think that system could work. Now, to start, I am not going to recommend that we simply throw out the entire federal immigration apparatus and, force your city to create its own version of ICE. Obviously, it is insane to expect my local town to create and manage immigration enforcement all on its own. That stuff I talked about in the earlier part of this episode about how having a central body for immigration enforcement can be more efficient and cheaper than trying to do a bunch of little immigration bureaus, that still does ring true. So, localism isn't going to involve passing any big federal bill abolishing federal immigration courts or whatever. Instead, here's how I picture things working. We keep around all the federal apparatus, we keep around the whole central system, maybe we make it a little better by giving it some more funding. We even keep letting Congress pass some immigration laws, and the president boss around all the federal apparatus that we've decided to maintain. The key difference under the localist system is that the feds stop being the only show in town, and their laws cease to be controlling. We turn the pyramid of preemption upside down and make it so while the federal government and federal laws can provide a default, a floor of how immigration works, localities, not state governments, localities, can pass whatever laws they want about immigration. And those laws will completely override any contrary federal law within the territory of that locality. Want to make it so ICE isn't allowed to detain anyone who is an immigrant. Unless they have a warrant, and immigrants arrested in your community can't be deported unless they're proven to have committed certain crimes after a full trial, you can do that, and the feds have to listen. Want to make it so that ICE can just take anybody off the street for any reason, and any immigrant who is in your community without explicit permission from your local government automatically gets deported? Well, I think that's a dumbest idea, but you're free to do so. Want to straight up make it so that ICE can't even step foot in your community? Pass a local law, and it's done. Want to create your own Texas SB4 style immigration police force to work in coordination with the feds? Create your own locality level criminal offenses, and even give your county or municipal level state judges the authority to order deportations? Again, I wouldn't do that shit where I lived, but under localism, you would absolutely have the right to do this if that's what your community wanted. And the federal and state governments would just have to respect it. That's the core element of localism, whether it's immigration or housing or any of the other myriad issues that we are all trying to figure out and none of us can reach any fucking agreement on. Your community, your laws, your direct political choice, made by the level of government closest and most accountable to you. No more needing to struggle against distant bodies of hostile people who don't live where you do and don't understand your way of life, but nevertheless are somehow given control over the laws in your community. No more winner-takes-all political system where we all have to hate each other because in order to change things in our own backyard, we have to win at the state or federal level, and one side winning at those levels necessarily means another side losing. Just the agency to make your own decisions about all the issues that matter, including all these political, highly normative, not easy to answer questions about who do you want to live in your community and how somebody can lose that privilege. Every community is going to have different answers to those questions. And with localism, every community has the freedom to turn those answers into local policy without either forcing that policy onto anyone else or having anyone else force policy onto them. A few caveats. First, to be clear, reforming immigration via localism is only possible via absolute localism, aka the kind of localism where the pyramid of preemption gets turned upside down so that local law preempts state and federal law, except for the rights granted under the Constitution, which will remain completely unalterable by any level of government, including local. As we've discussed in past episodes, there is another form of localism called reformist localism, under which the relationship between local government and the federal government remains unchanged, and instead local government is given the ability to legislate within matters of local concern without being preempted by the state government. The reformist models of localism also involves creating amendments to state constitutions that mirror the federal 10th Amendment by reserving to local governments any powers not explicitly delegated to state governments. But as you can see, since reformist localism doesn't give local governments any power to disregard federal law, and immigration law is federal law, it isn't going to give local governments the ability to start making immigration policy judgments. So if you're interested in localism as a way to reform immigration, then you need to go all the way with absolutist upside-down preemption localism, rather than going for reformist, state-focused localism. Relatedly, even assuming you do hop on the absolutist localism train and are raring to go when it comes to making immigration work the way that you want it to in your own community, there is one thing that you're not going to be able to do, and that thing is get rid of or otherwise fuck around with birthright citizenship. Like I said, even in absolute localism, there is one area that local agency does not extend to, and that's the scope of the rights and civil liberties granted to us by the Constitution, which I would all think we can agree are hugely important, and that no government should be able to deprive us of them, whether that government is local or otherwise. And birthright citizenship is one of those constitutional rights. Most liberals probably won't care about that, but given the current view of the right wing, some of my Republican listeners, if any of you are still surviving, might. I'll just say that this is the same principle, localism can't fuck with constitutional rights, that also keeps some local governments from doing insane shit like saying the Second Amendment doesn't exist and trying to seize your guns. Constitutional rights are important, and we can't let anybody disturb them. So localism will let you pass any rules you want about what immigrants are allowed to remain in your community and when/if the feds are allowed in to remove them, but absolutely no passing a local law saying that your locality no longer respects birthright citizenship. And that's today's episode. Things were a little more loosey-goosey, a little more ranty and personal opinion-y than some other episodes. I'll fully admit that immigration is an area I care a lot about, and some of my biases undoubtedly seep through into the discussion. Hopefully you can ignore me living out and focus on my central point, which is that the current state of immigration hurts everybody by preventing people on the ground from expressing their values through the laws that apply in their own community. And believe me, immigration isn't the only area where top-down federal and state preemption is destroying political agency to all of our detriment. Next time, we'll be delving into a particular special interest of mine, an area of law and of politics that has had a pretty major resurgence in the past few years, a resurgence that is currently on its way to dying, thanks to how fucking bad the federal government is at operating within this space. So join me in the next episode, where we discuss localism and organized labor. Catch y'all then. If that sounds interesting, please be sure to follow us on Spotify or on our YouTube channel at LocalistPod. That's Localist with a T, pod. If these long-form podcasts aren't your thing, then we also do these great 3-minute long YouTube shorts that give a more condensed version of the podcast episodes. And check us out on Blue Sky at localistpod.bluesky.social. Again, that's localist with a T. Finally, if you have any questions or comments, send me an email at localistpod@gmail.com. A huge thank you to Kevin MacLeod for letting me use the 2 songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.